Friends, we gather together this morning to celebrate the life and to honor the memory of Robert Newman. Robert's family so very much appreciates your presence here with them this morning, which offers them a great deal of comfort and support. Adonai ma'adam v'teda'ehu ben enosh v'achashvehu. O Lord, what are we that you have regard for us? What are we that you are mindful of us? We are like a breath, our days are as a passing shadow. We come and we go like grass, which in the morning shoots up renewed, in the evening it fades and it withers. You cause us to turn to dust, saying, "Return, you mortal creatures." Would that we were wise, that we understood whither we are going. For when we die, we carry nothing away, our glory does not accompany us. Mark the wholehearted and behold the upright, they shall have peace. Let us take comfort together in the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He guideth me in straight paths for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Kohelet, the author of the biblical book of Ecclesiastes, reminds us that for everything there is a season. A time for every experience under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to discard, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. Dr. Robert I. Newman died early this past Monday morning at the age of 93. He lived a rich life and full of years. He was content, and we will miss him. Robert Newman was born and raised in Canton, Ohio, to Meyer and Helen Newman. His father was an immigrant who came from Slovakia to escape serving in the Emperor's army. He and other members of his family settled in Canton, Ohio, and in surrounding areas, where the breadwinners were mostly small and self-employed merchants of one kind or another. Meyer was a butcher. Robert himself grew up amidst a large, extended family, which gathered frequently for loud and vibrant get-togethers. He attended Canton-McKinley High School, whose student body consisted of a wide variety of ethnic groups. And so already during his formative years, Robert took for granted the wide diversity of his fellow human beings. And already at his young age, he was a studious and a focused individual whose obvious intellectual acumen was captured by the nickname by which he was known, Professor. Aside from being an excellent student, Robert also took piano lessons and was a member of his school's debate team, on which he competed at a championship level. After graduating from high school, Robert matriculated at Oberlin College, which he attended for a couple of years before enlisting in the Army during World War II. In the Army, Robert served in France, where he worked as a lab technician and trained to assist in surgical operations. Alas, the carnage that he saw from the Battle of the Bulge and from other battles made a lasting impression on him, though evidently he never talked about it. When he returned from the war, he resumed his studies at Oberlin College for another year or so before entering medical school at Western Reserve University. After receiving his medical degree, he interned at Bellevue Hospital in New York City and then served as a resident at Mount Sinai Hospital, also in New York City. Having finished his training, Robert and his wife, Elaine, returned to Cleveland where he began to practice medicine. His early years were lean ones, though, and so Robert supplemented his income by working in the infirmary at the Jones and Laughlin Steel Company and by selling his blood to the Red Cross. Finally, he opened his own practice right above the old China Gate restaurant at Cedars Center. As in all things, Robert took the practice of medicine in both its technical and in its ethical dimensions with consummate thoroughness and seriousness. He was, in the words of his sons, with whom I spoke yesterday afternoon, a fantastic physician who cared deeply about his patients and who conscientiously kept up with the newest research by reading important medical journals. Even very late in his life, when he was long retired, he continued to read pivotal journals like the New England Journal of Medicine, though, as he confessed to his son James, I read them, but I don't remember what I've read. But as devoted as Robert was to his patients and to the highest standards of medical practice, his passionate approach to life led him to all different kinds of interests. Photography, for one. Indeed, from his earliest days, Robert had exhibited a keen interest in photography, and not only in the taking of pictures. He constructed his own darkrooms and was always on the lookout for new equipment. And Robert won prizes for his photography. His son James remembers the time when he and his father went to an auction one Sunday afternoon where certain darkroom equipment was being auctioned off. Now, this is not exactly remarkable in its own right, but James told me that that very afternoon was the one during which all kinds of sports fans, and Robert himself was a sports fan, were captivated by the playing of the very first Super Bowl. So while football enthusiasts were glued to their television sets, Robert and James were examining darkroom equipment. In addition, Robert was deeply interested in literature, especially, so I was told, in the challenging novels and short stories of James Joyce. Not only did he read these works, he delved into some of the secondary literature on Joyce. As always, Robert was not a dabbler nor a dilettante. Rather, he explored the depth of the things in which he was interested. And he developed a passion for painting. He took classes in painting and drawing, perhaps at Tri-C, and as a bonus, he met at one of them the wonderful companion of his last 12 years, Joyce Gordon. Then there is his passion for sailing, an activity that he had already cultivated in his youth when he taught himself how to sail. And once again, Robert Newman excelled, becoming a champion of his club. But as usual, he dug deeper and educated himself about naval architecture. That is the theory of the design of ships. the better to understand why and how a boat actually works. In addition, he read books on the psychology of competition, and especially on the notion, and a notion about which I never heard one word before yesterday afternoon. He read books especially on the notion of deliberate defeat, how people win, and why and how they sometimes try to lose. Now, why did he explore the psychological aspects of deliberate losing? So that, through understanding, he himself would never fall victim to that syndrome. And Robert's sons told me something that I found fascinating, that their own interests often converged with his. When I asked them whether that meant that their father had pressured them to follow in his footsteps, they said no, not at all. In fact, they took up music and sailboat racing and photography because their father's enthusiasm for all these things was simply infectious. And even though their father was not a demonstrative person, his interest in these activities was so genuine and so inherently persuasive that they just naturally followed in his footsteps. And from Robert's point of view, these shared activities were good ways of being close to his children, something he evidently craved. Indeed, Robert was not the kind of person to push his views on anyone else. His daughter-in-law, Lorna, remarked at our meeting yesterday afternoon that during a conversation about photography that she once had with Robert, she noticed along the way that he was not pushing his views on her, that he never came across in a competitive way, never flaunted his vast experience and expertise. What he did exhibit during that conversation, she remembers, was the spirit of congeniality, collegiality, generosity, and kindness. And then there is golf, one of Robert Newman's central and abiding passions. He grew up playing golf, and he never lost his zest for it. He had a number of buddies with whom he played regularly down through the years, mostly on Wednesday afternoons. In addition, he watched a lot of golf on TV. And when in his later years it became increasingly difficult for him to walk, he once remarked to one of his sons that, "I think I will work now on my short game." In fact, he continued to enjoy this passion of his, playing as recently as 2 years ago at the age of 91. And Robert and Elaine had a wonderful 55-year marriage that included a number of common interests, along with a strong bond of mutual love and sympathy. And Robert was lucky, near the end of his life, to have had a dear companion, Joyce Gordon, who supported him in sickness and in health, and who was always attentive to his needs. Robert Newman is survived by his sons Michael, James, and Perry, by his daughters-in-law, Lorna, Marlene, and Sharon, by his grandchildren, Victor, Nathan, Sarah, Ilana, and Lenny, by his sister Arlene, and by his companion Joyce. He was predeceased by his parents Meyer and Helen, and by his wife Elaine. Robert Newman was a multi-talented, serious, and devoted individual. Since he had a robust sense of who he was, he had no need to overtly promote himself. He was self-confident without being arrogant, omnicompetent without being boastful. and he loved his family and his friends in his own authentic and quiet way. He loved, and he was loved. And as he said at his 90th birthday party, he had had a good life, a life filled with medicine and family and friends and activities that nourished him. He was the most ethical person I ever met, was how his son Michael put it. We will miss Robert Newman, and we will never forget him. Zichrono livracha. His memory will always be our blessing. Amen. I now want to call on two people who will speak about the life and the qualities and the accomplishments of Robert Newman. First, his sister Arlene, and then his son Perry.
Thank you, Rabbi. You think that's a tough act to follow? That was a tough act to follow. We were a lot of cousins growing up. Our mothers were sisters, our fathers were brothers, sort of a European thing that happened, and it was very great. But I had to follow that guy through the school years. And one of my earliest remembrances is his walking me to school one day. Not happily, I'm sure he was not. Who wanted a kid sister tagging along? He was a big 4 years older than I, and he was a man of the school. And I would get there, and by the time I got to the latter grades, oh, you're Bob Newman's sister. He was so bright. I'm so glad to have you in my class. What does that tell you? That you darn well better be good. And I tried. I was never as good as Bob in schools and scholastics. He was a champion in the state of Ohio in extemporaneous speaking and in debate. I went too, but he was the champion. We had good times. I grew up in his shadow. And by the time I got to high school, he was at Oberlin, where I think the rabbi read all my notes before I got up here. And he did enlist in the Army before the draft got him, I guess so he could get into a field that he would be interested in, and that was medicine. He did fight. Well, he didn't fight. He was a medic. He went through the training periods at Letterman Hospital in San Francisco. He went through the Battle of the Bulge. The only time he talked about it, the only thing he talked about, he said, it was awfully cold. Very, very cold. I would nag Bob, especially in the last 20 years or so. Sit down at the computer, write the stories about your time in the service. They were fascinating. I'm sure you have a million stories to tell. Not interested. Bob, sit at the computer and write. My brother did not take nagging easily. He did not suffer naggers. And he dismissed me with a flip of the hand, and he never did write them down. And I'm sure there's a lot of stories that will never be told, but this is not atypical of the guys who served in World War II. You all probably know the rest of the journey. Medical school, 3 wonderful sons, 5 grandchildren, years at Mount Sinai in New York and here in Cleveland, his practice. But there were some funny things that happened along the way. I was happening to get my master's degree at NYU when Bob was at Mount Sinai. And I became very ill with a kind of, I think they call it mononucleosis. I called him up. He was a resident there, I guess. And I said, Bob, if you had a patient that had these symptoms, what would you say? He'd say, mononucleosis. I said, well, your sister has got it. Hold everything, he said. Hold everything. I'm coming over. This is amazing. My brother is going out of his way, leaving the hospital, coming to the west side where I had a little apartment. It was a snowstorm. He had a little tin can of a car, I don't know what it was, bounded up the stairs to my second floor apartment, pulled out a syringe, mopped my arm, took a sample. I need a good mono slide. Take care of yourself. Now, when I tell this story later in life, I never said that. I never did. While he was in medical school, one day I played tennis. I tried to play tennis, and I was reaching for a backhand. I twisted something in my hip. I called him at wherever he lived across the road at Western Reserve University. I refused to call it Case Western Reserve. And I said, Bob, I did something to my left hip, and it is very painful. What do you think? We don't study left hips until next week. You know, it's always good to have a doctor in the family. And then, of course, most recently in my life, maybe 10 years ago, my birthday falls very soon in December, and he called me up. I was living in Florida by that time, and he called me up to wish me a happy birthday, and he said, what are you doing for your birthday? I said, well, you know, it's Hanukkah, and my friend is making latkes. I said, but you don't know what latkes are. He says, latkes, I know. What's Hanukkah? So he really had, in addition to all his brilliance, and there was a lot of that, and all his mastery of painting, he was good at it. His photography, he was good at. Being a father, he was great at that. I love those boys, and I love their wives. And if I had had children, I could never have had anything better than what they are. They're beautiful kids and grandchildren. And I got to tell you one little thing. My mother was a strict stickler for manners, propriety. Children should be raised properly, well-groomed, and quiet. And she had a bridge game that would meet every Wednesday or so. She made great popovers. That was the best part of it. And the ladies would come over, and my brother would maybe wander in. He was a little boy at the time. And my mother, being proper, say, hello, Bobby. And, of course, this became a family joke. We even have T-shirts that say hello, say hello. Well, the times have changed, and Bob is no longer with us. So I'm going to change that mantra. I'm going to say, good night, Bob. Thank you, Robert.
And Darlene, you think you had it tough? Okay. How do you like going third in this gang here? So in thinking about what to say today, I've been struck by a number of things. First, of course, is that my dad lived a long and full life, and thankfully when he died, he had not been suffering from a lengthy illness. He had not endured painful and protracted treatments for a terminal disease. He was not living in a cold and impersonal hospital far from home, and he was not alone. He had loved and been loved, and in his final months particularly had been cared for exquisitely by my brother James and by Joyce, whose compassion and kindness has been remarkable. He lived, I believe, a happy and fruitful life. He succeeded as a talented physician. He had the opportunity to pursue many interests, from photography to sailing to painting and drawing to travel and music. He was a great father to me and my brothers Mike and James. He was a lovingly tender and charmingly crusty grandfather. He loved my mother immeasurably, and he loved a good joke, though inevitably he botched the punchlines, and over time he left the telling of them to us. He also loved a good dry martini, and once after my mom died, Pawbone, as we called him, came with me to Israel on a business trip. This was before the global phenomenon of designer cocktails had swept the country. And every time he ordered a martini in the hotel bar, the bartender, quite often a high school-age Israeli girl, inevitably brought him a glass of Martini and Rossi pink vermouth. Finally, on the third evening of our trip, he'd had enough. He walked to the bar and said rather gently, but pointedly, "This isn't a martini. Let me show you how to make one." And a small crowd gathered in the lobby at the Amit Park Plaza on Hayarkon and watched him mix a perfect dry martini with 3 olives. It is probably no exaggeration to say that as a result, an entire generation of Israelis now understands that a martini requires gin and is not simply a glass of Martini and Rossi. And as I think of it, that trip to Israel produced a number of interesting Pawbone-related anecdotes. As you may know, Israel is renowned for its security apparatus and the vigor of its screening procedures, particularly at the airport. As we were in the long security queue to check in for our departure, another young Israeli, also probably about 20, asked my dad the standard security questions. What was the purpose of your visit? What did you do while you were here, etc.? And then she asked him, and remember, she was probably 20 and he was about 80 at this time, did you visit any religious sites? My dad must have appeared unsure, or more likely uninterested. This gave the security agent an opening. Did you go to the old city? Yes. What did you see? Lots of things. Did you go to the Kotel? Looking at me. Did we? Finally, do you speak Hebrew? No. Do you belong to a synagogue? No. Are you Jewish? Brief existential pause. Yes. Did you have a bar mitzvah? No. Hearing this, the security agent moved in for the clincher. Why not? At which point my dad muttered something about having been confirmed, but by that point we were waved through security. Later, my dad allowed as to how he liked Israelis because he said, they're plucky. As the youngest in the family, I'm sure I had it easiest in terms of any discipline that needed to be meted out. But truth to tell, I think we were all very fortunate, and I think my dad was a pretty fortunate man. Though he endured his share of challenges, a childhood in the Depression, service abroad in World War II, a period of considerable poverty and then very meager means as a young physician, and the inevitable bruises that life and human relationships can inflict, I believe he was a very happy, contented man. He lived well, he loved and was loved well, and now he leaves us well. This is the natural order of things: to live, to die, to let others live, and to have them hold you as a blessed memory. Lots of love, Pawbone. Your memory will indeed be for all of us a blessing.
O God of life, amid the ceaseless tides of change which sweep away the generations, your love remains to comfort us and to give us hope. Around us are life and death, decay and renewal, the flowing rhythm that all things obey. Our life is a dance to a song that we cannot hear. Its melody courses through us for a little while, then it seems to cease. Whence the melody, and whither does it go? In darkness as in light, we turn to you, the source of life and the answer to all of life's mysteries. Will you please rise now for the El Mole Rachamim? El Mole Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Hamtzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, Im Kadoshim Tahorim Kazohar Harakia Mazhirim, Et Nishmat Yakirenu Shahalach La'olamo, Bala Rachamim Yastireo B'Sefer Kanafav La'olamim, V'yitzror Bitzror HaChayim Et Nishmato, Adonai Nachalato V'yanuach B'Shalom Al Mishkavo V'Nomar Amen. Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to Robert I. Newman, our loved one who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let him find refuge in the shadow of your wings, and let his soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. God is his inheritance. May he rest in peace. And let us say together, Amen. Will you please be seated? I want to announce that the family of Robert Newman will receive friends at the residence of James and Marlene Newman at 25072 Bridgeton Drive in Beechwood. They will receive friends immediately following our interment.